where do we draw the line between traditional masculine virtues and toxic masculine traits? At what exact moment does the manly desire to establish structure and order for both the safety of himself and those around him become the tyrannical compulsion to exert self-serving control through manipulation or the threat of punishment? The conversation about toxic masculinity is full of assumptions, accusations, and above all else, lazy language. Regardless of your personal beliefs, group affiliation, or secret political agenda, comment sections across the internet repeatedly, regrettably, and predictably regress into these shadowy ping-pong matches of toxic masculine, toxic feminine finger-pointing, which perpetuate an unconscious or even outright hostility between men and women. Now, I'm not saying that it's a failed endeavor to try and pinpoint healthy and unhealthy energetic expressions, but if we're looking to heal our grievances, then we are approaching this conversation from the entirely wrong perspective. It is impossible to reduce a full spectrum of masculine or feminine psychological maturation and morality into simplistic, dualistic black and white categories of good and bad. Masculinity expresses itself across a full spectrum, which varies on an ever-evolving, permeable membrane depending on that individual history and the collective unit of men or a group of ideas or a lineage, a tradition. Lazy language is the key to resolving this issue because it's also the problem. Language frames our reality. Words create worlds. And it is my strong personal belief that the very word toxic should be banished from our tongue when we're trying to have the conversation about healing the developmental wounding in men and women. Interestingly, I've noticed how the concept of toxicity and the word toxic starts to naturally fall away from people's vocabulary when they're committed to doing the inner work of healing that internal pollution rather than shadowboxing with the opposite gender or some opposite political party for a sense of pseudo-powerfulness and artificial inflation. Because really that's the key to what it means to heal the masculine or the feminine. It's about changing our perception through our language, at least at the very first stage. Sometimes it's heartbreaking to stand back and watch what's happening because it feels like we're frozen in time. We're like children wrestling on the playground, and how could we expect anything less? The vast majority of us are looping on unhelpful developmental wounds that we picked up during our childhood, which perpetuate this feeling of unsafety and mistrust inside of ourselves, let alone our relationships with the outer world. Lazy language, unconscious hate bonds, and this tragic sense of unresolved childhood wounding are the major barriers to healing the rift between the sexes and hopefully getting us closer towards truly compassionate and truly understanding relationships between men and women. This question and this theme of masculinity and femininity has been at the forefront of my mind for years, both in terms of my own developmental history, trying to figure out what it means to be a man who also has a sensitive side, an artistic side, a more soft and gooey side, to use that language, but also in client work with both men and women in private containers with a trauma-focused, introspective agenda. I'm in an interesting position to comment on this because as a man who actually leans somewhat more towards the traditional, harder masculine values, I've also had the experience of supporting women, for example, with healing from sexual trauma and other types of unfortunate wounding at the hands of men. So, it's important that we talk about this. The way that I want to go about the conversation of toxic masculinity is going to come from a bit of a curveball angle to what you're probably used to, because today's episode of Inner Work Essentials is going to look at the inner patriarch. The book that we're going to look at today is The Shadow King by Sidra Stone. Now, this is an archetypal view of what happens when the worst and the best aspects of masculinity get stored inside the psychological matrix of female egoic identity. To put it another way, this book explores what happens when the outer patriarchy becomes an inner patriarchal figure and how that can cause damage and wounding inside of women, which is the key to understanding the major frustration of this ping-pong match of toxic masculine, toxic feminine finger-pointing. Because women who've been hurt and women who've suffered want things to change. Of course, there are also men who have suffered at the hands of immature men and the hands of immature brothers. But the way in through this conversation is going to provide, hopefully, a new perspective for you. So let's go into the idea of the inner patriarch and the Jungian parts work approach towards healing the toxic masculine, which I'm now going to refer to as the immature masculine or the developing masculine. So, reading from the book. What is the inner patriarch? According to Sidra Stone, who's worked with men and women for decades. The inner patriarch is the voice or subpersonality within us that carries the ancient patriarchal traditions, values, and rules of the last 6 millennia. Like the men in the dream, speaking earlier in the book, he is an internalized version of the outer patriarchy. As with the outer patriarchy, he functions both protectively and destructively. And this is why I'm choosing to go into this book for today's episode, because Sidra Stone has an awareness of both the life-affirmative and life-denying aspects of traditional masculinity. Over the next few pages, she actually lists some of the more positive qualities like structure and order for safety, and rulemaking for justice and a sense of power that serves other people, not just himself. But what happens when the immature masculine takes control and the shadowy elements come through? Well, we get all of the wounding and all of the worst parts of men. So, what does the inner patriarch sound like? Might as well go back to the book. There are some really good examples here that both men and women will relate to. This is, again, the internal construct or the internal dialogue that indicates that we might have a bit of an issue or some work left to do with healing our inner or outer masculine energy. So, a few examples of what the inner patriarch might sound like. Quote, this is what he'd be saying in the internal dialogue. So, if you're a woman and you relate to some of these phrases, it's a good indication that the inner patriarch may be running amok, and then you'll want to fight the outer patriarchs or get into difficult relationships with men of certain degrees of immaturity, let's say. An unmarried woman is an unfulfilled woman. Women should never pursue men. Men should always do the pursuing. A woman without a child has not fulfilled her destiny. Women are basically weaker than men. Women have no sense of values. Women lack focus. Women are illogical. Women are too emotional and always overreacting. Women are needy. Basically, there's only one thing they're good for, and quote, that's sex. We've heard these ideas before, right? So where does this put us? Well, it puts us a little bit closer towards clarity when we're trying to unravel the conversation around toxic masculinity and healthy masculinity. Because although this is only a superficial glimpse into what a Jungian archetypal approach to healing these wounds might be, it's important to properly identify the voice of the masculine in its many-sided expressions. Again, masculinity and femininity express across an entire emotional, moral, and psychological spectrum of complexity. Higher and lower levels of expression are not fixed stages, but permeable membranes that individual men and women, when accessing the manliness conceptually inside of themselves, will shift through on a day-to-day basis. So if we're really looking to heal, if we're really looking to encourage more men and women to change the way that they relate to the masculine, we need healthier, lucid, precise language, not this very sad, very immature, very childhood wounding related, finger blaming, good and bad, he said, she said, and I am a victim. The path towards healing the masculine and the path towards healing the femininity, the feminine, is really the case of understanding and expressing a deeper, empathetic understanding towards the wounds that we sustained in our childhood that led to these kinds of voices being our inner dialogue. Because it's only when the inner dialogue is strong enough and powerful enough that we become convinced that there's more out there that we need to fight against. I'm not saying that there aren't issues within men. I've worked with men, I am a man, I have my own issues, but that concept of toxicity and that concept of blaming and shaming and fighting or creating defensive positions as if we aren't meant to work together gets us very, very nowhere. We don't get very far at all. So the first step for women is to really identify what masculinity means to them within themselves and how that shows up as something like an inner patriarchal figure. For men, it's also to honestly and non-defensively admit the areas which are a bit shadowy for them. For example, I'll put myself in the spotlight. For myself, I can definitely get a bit inner patriarch, or at least immature patriarch rather than healthy patriarch, when it comes to being stubborn, when it comes to having a firm point and making a judgment that begins as clear-minded and life-affirmative, but can then become a bit too rigid and not let any other opinions come my way. Just one example. I don't want this video to go on for too long, so I'm gonna keep it short and keep it tight, because the real solution to healing the toxic masculinity crisis is not only the shift in language and not only the compassionate understanding of what it means to be dealing with adults who have hurt children inside of them, or parental figures that are living inside of them as certain internal voices. It's actually understanding the masculine and feminine psyche at much greater depth. So, if you want to understand the masculine psyche, at least the fourfold elements of the masculine psyche, the king, warrior, magician, and the lover, then click on over to the next video in Inner Work Essentials, where we're going to do a deeper exploration of what is by now one of the most famous understandings of the masculine mind. You're not going to want to miss it.